Credit cards, huh? Isn't it crazy that these little plastic or metal things in my hand right here can literally make or break your finances? To some, these things are literally the devil, and then to others, it's their ticket to free travel around the world. And for those of y'all that think of credit cards as the devil, part of me doesn't blame you. I mean, look at the big problem that we have in the US right now when it comes to credit card debt. In 2023, the total outstanding credit card balances in the US crossed over $1 trillion, which is just insane. But if we take the flip side of this, you also see people like myself even that are earning $25,000 worth of free travel just from credit card points. So why is there this big discrepancy? Well, really my whole goal with this video here today is to demystify the topic of credit cards and help you to put yourself in camp number 2 rather than camp number 1. Now, this is going to be a very long, very information-packed video here today. I literally have a presentation prepared for this and everything. So I'd recommend that right now you go ahead and just pause the video, go grab yourself a drink and maybe a snack, as well as a pen and paper if you want to really take some notes here. And of course, as with every one of my videos, but especially pertinent to this one, I'm going to leave timestamps down below to each section of this video. And I do apologize if I skip over some things you think I should have covered in this video, but I tried to get as much as I possibly could in this one. But there will be more videos like this to come this year, as long as everything goes to plan. Also, please be sure to help each other out down in the comments. I can't always get to every single one of the comments on my videos, but if you see some beginners down there and you're more of an advanced player in the credit card game, please be sure to just go down there and answer each other's questions and make the whole community just a better place. So now let's talk about how this video is going to be broken down. We're going to have 5 different sections in this video, each covering a very important topic of the credit card game in general, and hopefully we'll end up touching on basically every single aspect of this game that we love to play in this video. But as you can see here, section 1 is going to be all about the credit card basics. Section 2 is going to be about how credit cards work. Section 3 is going to be understanding your credit card statements, so we'll be running through one of those live. Section 4 is going to be about responsible credit card usage, which is obviously super important. And then section 5 is going to be about maximizing your credit card benefits, which is how, for example, people like me get to travel the world for quote unquote free, or just put some cash back in their pockets for all the spend they're already doing. So let's go ahead and dive in with section number 1, credit card basics. So first of all, what is the difference between a credit card and a debit card? Well, with credit cards, you are given access to a line of credit issued by a bank, which means that this money that you are given on this credit card in the form of a credit limit is not your actual money. With a debit card, on the other hand, as you probably know, you are getting money deducted directly from your bank account every single time you make a purchase, meaning this is your money. So a credit card, you're getting like an IOU from a bank, basically saying that at the end of the month, you're going to pay your credit card off in full. And if you don't, obviously there are going to be some fees associated with that, as well as a lot of interest and just a lot of stuff we're going to cover here in this video. But that money is not directly taken out of your account until you make that payment. So this is obviously the first place where people do start to get in trouble whenever they start to think that the credit limits that they have on their credit cards is their money. That is not the case. You are taking the bank's money and using it to later pay off yourself. So let's get into the pros and cons of both a credit and a debit card so we can just, see the difference between them even further. Let's go ahead and just break down the credit card side here, starting with the pros, and the first one being that it helps you to build credit history whenever you have a credit card. Credit history is super important in the US, as y'all probably know, but when it comes to doing anything like going to get a mortgage or going to get a car loan or anything like that, you're going to need to have a credit score, and having a credit card helps you to build that. It could also help you to destroy your credit score if you use them irresponsibly, but by the end of this one, I don't think you will be. Credit cards also give you a bunch of purchase and travel protections, fraud protections on top of that as well, which is a big key difference between debit and credit cards. And then of course, the main reason that most everybody uses credit cards are for the rewards and benefits. Now, the cons on the other hand are that credit cards can lead to debt, obviously. If you spend too much on your credit cards and don't pay them off, you're going to be stuck in credit card debt. On top of that, like I mentioned just a second ago, if you use your credit cards irresponsibly, you can actually hurt your credit score like crazy, but that is obviously up to you in being responsible or not. And then if you are somebody that is irresponsible with your cards and you don't pay them off on time and in full every month, you're going to be stuck with very high interest on your credit cards, as well as a lot of fees that are associated with them as well. On the debit card side of things, the pros is that one, you can very much avoid debt if you use your debit cards how they're supposed to be used, because like I said earlier, the money that you're spending on a debit card is getting directly taken out of your bank account every time you use it, rather than you getting a line of credit from the bank that you later have to pay back. On top of that, debit cards are going to be, cards that don't have any annual fees associated with them, although they do have other kinds of fees, which we're going to talk about here in a second. The cons of debit cards is that, for one, they have usually no rewards associated with them, and if they do, it might be for like 0.5% back on all of your purchases, which is just not going to move the needle. And with that lack of rewards, you're technically paying more money than you would if you would just use a credit card for all of your purchases. And that's because every store or company that you buy things from these days has their prices raised by, say, like 3%, because whenever you swipe a credit card, they get charged that 3% fee, for example. So if you're not getting rewarded on that by using a debit card, card, you're paying net 3% more technically than a credit card user is who is getting rewards. And then on top of that, with a debit card, you are not going to be building any credit history, at least for the most part. They do have some fraud protections, but they also have a lack of fraud protections compared to credit cards. And the big difference between them is that with a credit card, you are using the bank's money once again, which means that if there is a fraudulent charge on your credit card, the bank is the one that fronts that bill. You can dispute it and that charge never actually comes through your bank account. With the debit card, if you do have a fraud transaction come through, that's money directly associated with your checking account, which is a lot more dangerous. And then debit cards are going to have some fees associated with them, specifically stuff like overdraft fees if you were to put too much money on your debit card than you had in your bank account. But overall, the fees are less than credit cards. So at this point, you might already know the answer to this question, but I wanted to pose the thought of why then use credit over debit? To me, it basically all comes down to why not get rewarded for all of the spend that you're already doing. The big caveat to this is that you have to be using a credit card exactly like it is a debit card, meaning that you have to only be putting purchases on that card that you have money for in your bank account and could pay off right away. And of course, on top of that, you need to be paying off your cards on time and in full every single month, or you will be stuck with all of those interest payments and all of those fees that we talked about just a second ago. And if you are somebody that is, struggling with overspending, or you don't think that you're responsible enough for a credit card, it's much safer to stick to debit. I just think that a lot of us are financially responsible enough to know that we need to pay off our cards every single month. And if you do that, you might as well get rewarded for all that spend. On top of that, as I've alluded to a couple times here, I did just make a video about how I was able to earn over $10,000 worth of free travel, technically like $25,000 plus, by using a credit card. And obviously that's something you will never be able to do by using a debit card alone. The only time I actually do use debit cards over credit cards is going to be when I go into a bank and need to withdraw some cash or something like that, or obviously at an ATM doing the same thing. But for the most part, I literally haven't touched a debit card in like the last few years of me being in the credit card game. Now, I thought that at this point, we might as well go over the different components of a credit card and what each of these numbers mean. So whenever you got your first one, for example, you would know what all these numbers actually do for you. So the first 6 to 8 digits on a credit card are going to refer to the payment network and the issuer. And then the last remaining digits are going to refer to your personal card account. As for the expiration date on your credit card only applies to that specific card and not your overall card account. So for example, if one of my cards does expire in say December of 2024, this card would then no longer be able to be used, but I could just order the replacement card and my card account itself with the same card number and everything would still be active. The cardholder name, the chip, the hologram, all that stuff I think is pretty self-explanatory. The magnetic strip on the back, of course, is going to be how you swipe your credit card and use it, even though these days we basically all use chip or tap to pay. The signature box is less and less used. It's more for credit card verification in the past, but I've never signed the back of one of my cards and I've never been asked to. And then the CVC code is going to be your card verification code or your card verification value if it's, a CVV. And that's again for fraud prevention. If someone wants to get a hold of all of your credit card numbers, technically you have your CVC or CVV code to keep you even more hidden. But at that point, you're probably screwed anyways. Okay, so with that covered, let's go ahead and just discuss the process of how you can get approved for a credit card if you are at the very beginning stages. So method number one that I want to cover here is one that I think most people should be doing if they are under the age of 18 especially, and that's going to be becoming an authorized user. Now you can become an authorized user of one of your parents' credit cards, for example, or maybe a very trusted friend, but for the most part, you want it to be somebody that you know is extremely responsible with their finances and has a good credit score already, since you're going to be assuming their credit history. And obviously, if they don't have good credit history, then you're going to be the one that also gets hurt by that. But let's go over the pros and cons of this. The first pro is that it's really the simplest access to a credit card without any credit history. And like I just mentioned, you can build credit quickly since you are assuming the credit history on that credit card. So for example, if your mom has a card that is 10 years old and you become an authorized user on that 10-year credit history on that card is going to be added to your credit report in a sense. So as long as they are making their payments on time and in full every month and have a high credit score, that really helps you in the beginning stages. Some other pros is that for one, it could also help a friend or family member keep an active card open or earning more rewards, because they are going to be the ones that do earn the rewards on that card since you're just an authorized user. And if it's one of their lesser used cards, having you as an authorized user could help to keep that account active and not getting shut down. And then plus on top of that, if your parents want to track family spending on one single account, they could give authorized users to all the kids, for example, on one card, and all of that information would be combined into their main cardholder account. As for the cons, the first one I did mention earlier, and that's that if the account holder is delinquent on their card payments or anything like that, that's going to show up on your credit report as well, which is obviously bad. The second con is that you will possibly have to pay an added fee to add an authorized user to your account. This obviously doesn't happen with every card, but for a card like the Amex Platinum, for example, at the time of your recording, you have to pay $195 per authorized user on your account. So that could obviously add up quick. The last two cons I have here is that, for one, the account holder can remove you at any time, which then that credit history would fall off of your report. Again, just needs to be somebody that you trust and talk to regularly. And then lastly, it could cause conflict with whoever that account holder is. And that was method number one. But let's go ahead and dive into the second method, which might be for those of y'all that either don't have somebody to add you as an authorized user, or maybe you're a little bit older in college or what have you, and you just want to go ahead and get your own card set up, not under somebody else's name. So what you're going to want to do here is get a starter branded credit card. Usually these come in the form of student credit cards, secured credit cards, or just cards designed for people with no credit. When it comes to student credit cards, my recommendation is just really to get a credit card with a bank who you already bank with, or just like in general. And ideally that credit card is going to have some kind of rewards associated with it. One student credit card that's been floating around a lot lately is the Saver One student credit card, which I do think is a good credit card if you can get approved for it. They're still weird when it comes to the application because it's Capital One, but that's one that I would be looking at. Whenever I got started with the Chase Freedom Student, which is no longer an active card that you can get, but we'll talk about what you can go with Chase instead here in a second. As for secured credit cards, I would say just, again, get one that has no annual fee and just helps you to build credit. When it comes to all these beginner credit cards, I just don't want you to overthink things. It's really just important that you get started and don't get that analysis paralysis here. And if you can get one with the bank that you already bank with to make things easy, that's great. But the main focus here is just getting that credit history started with a no annual fee card so that you don't ever have to cancel it in the future. And then lastly, we have the beginner targeted credit cards, which, for example, the Chase Freedom Rise from Chase, which is a new card as of last year, is one of. So this is a card that is basically a student credit card, but for non-students in a way, meaning that they don't expect you to have a credit history when applying for this card, unlike their other credit cards. But if you do have a bank account with Chase, you increase the odds of you being approved for it. Hence why I'm recommending going about this beginner stage of the credit card journey in this way. As you can see here, I put my top choices of cards that I usually recommend people look at whenever they are starting their credit card game. But if you're a student, I would say that the Capital One Saver One student is a good choice. And if you're not a student, but you still need a beginner focused credit card, I would probably start with the Chase Freedom Rise, just because Chase's ecosystem is personally my favorite and the most beginner/intermediate friendly. But I would just get one that you can get approved for and just go with it. Just be careful if they try to sneak in any annual or monthly fees on you, because you obviously just don't want that. Now you might be asking, well, what happens when you apply? How do I do it? And just how does that process go? So the first thing that happens when you apply is that they are going to verify your identity, and that happens, through their back end of the actual credit card application. Then your credit is going to be checked for every single application, really. There are two different types of credit checks. There's a hard inquiry and a soft inquiry when it comes to credit cards. A lot of beginner credit cards will actually only soft pull you or give you a soft inquiry for actually pulling all of your information. But at the same time, there are a lot out there that will hard pull you, and that's the one that actually shows up on your credit report and dings your credit score by a few points every time you do one. Granted, this is a temporary ding and it's of a very small amount, so theoretically it should not hurt you that bad to do this, but ideally they would just soft pull you. And then of course at that point, you're going to find out the status of your application. You'll either be approved, denied, or you'll go to pending review. I would say that if you are denied or pending review, to call their reconsideration lines. So for example, if you got denied for the Chase Freedom Rise, you could call up Chase, get directed to their Chase reconsideration line, and that person may possibly be able to push your application through, since they are a human and not a computer just auto denying you. And then what happens after that? What now? Well, if you are to get approved for a credit card, you're going to gain access to a credit limit on that credit card that allows you to start making purchases on that card. Your credit limit initially for the very first credit card especially that you get is likely going to be very small, maybe $500 to $1,000. And over time you can raise this, but that's not the important thing right now. The important thing is developing the habit of using a credit card exactly how you would use a debit card, paying it off on time and in full every month, and just building that credit history over time. It's a long game. It's not a sprint here. Now let's get into section 2, which is all about how credit cards work. So to start this section off, I think the first thing we need to talk about is going to be APRs, or annual percentage rates. This is how your interest payments are calculated if you were to miss a credit card payment, and this is what gets people in serious financial trouble. As you can see from this graphic right here, the average interest rate on new credit card offers is basically 25%, and that is a massive number. Most other types of loans are going to have much lower interest than this, say in the 3 to 10 10% range, except obviously whenever we have high interest rate periods, which we're in right now. But to have an interest rate of 25% on a credit card, which is a consumer product, it's pretty insane, honestly. So that sounds crazy maybe, but let's go ahead and break down a couple of examples so you can see just how bad this gets. I went ahead and pulled up this credit card calculator online to see just what exactly would happen if you weren't to pay off your cards in full and how long it would take you to pay off the interest and principal on that credit card. So for both of the credit card balances here, I input $8,000 because that is the average amount of credit card debt that an American has these days, which is also just a wild statistic. And then with the average interest rate of about 25%, we can start to look at how long it would take us to pay these cards off. For the first option here, I said, well, let me just pay off $500 a month on this $8,000 balance, which is honestly a lot of money for some people to be able to even pay off. And if you were to do so, it would take you 1 year and 8 months to pay off that balance, and you would pay $1,832.18 in interest. So obviously you're mostly paying off principal here, and you can see from the graph that the interest does start to pick up at the latter half of this, whatever, 1 year and 8 month period. But the total amount of money that you are paying towards the bank is 19% made up of interest. Now, on the other hand, if you are somebody with the exact same credit card balance and interest rate, but you only can pay off $200 a month, it's going to take you 7 years and 3 months to pay off that balance. And look at the difference here between the principal and interest as well. You will be paying a total interest of $9,379.45. Your principal on this card was only for $8,000, so you're paying that again plus more in interest because you weren't able to make the payments on time. And the graph on the right is just insane to me. I mean, look at that interest line. It's just getting worse and worse. But as you can see here, it's just so important to only ever put charges on your credit cards that you actually can afford to put on those cards and pay them off on time and in full every single month, so you never get stuck in a situation like this. Now, if you've been a fan of the channel for a while, you'll know that I never talk about APRs, and that's because I'm under the assumption that obviously myself, as well as all of y'all, are never going to pay interest to a bank. If you're doing that, you are automatically losing the credit card game. Imagine you're in the second case again here, and you were somebody that with that $8,000 were able to hit a welcome bonus and got a lot of points, and you were able to take a trip that was worth $8,000 for free. Well, the joke's on you still, because you still paid more in interest than that trip, and you took a trip that you already couldn't afford. So it just doesn't make sense to not ever pay off your cards on time and in full. Hence why APRs to me don't matter, because they literally don't impact me at all. Obviously though, they should not be ignored if you're at the beginning stages of your credit card journey, because you need to understand how dangerous this stuff is. Now, one really important topic to cover here when it comes to paying off your credit cards is the statement date versus the due date on your credit card statements. Whenever I say paying off your cards on time and in full every month, that payment is going to be made by the payment due date, but the actual amount of money that is associated with that payment due date is going to come based on your statement date. It's going to get confusing, but I'm hoping that breaking it down like this will help y'all out a lot. So for the first side here, talking about statement dates, we know that these are also called statement close dates, just close date, etc. And this is the date that your monthly bill is going to be generated for your credit card, which is why your statement balance that is produced on your statement date is the total amount of money that you're going to have to pay off on that credit card by the due date. Well, at least as long as you want to avoid any interest or late fees or anything like that. The statement date is usually going to fall on the same day every month, and all of your posted transactions from the last statement date end to the beginning of the next statement are going to be reflected on this statement. And then just so you know, if your statement date does fall on a weekend, then it's going to be generated on the last working day before that weekend. So there might be a little bit of a discrepancy sometimes. The due date, on the other hand, is also called your payment due date, etc. It's the date that you need to make at least the minimum payment to avoid late fees or any interest charges. But if you only make the minimum payment, you will be paying interest on that credit card statement. So you always want to pay off your statement balance in full by the payment due date. Similarly to the statement dates, usually your payment due date is going to be the same. For example, the 15th of every month. And like I've said probably already 6 times in this video, it's best to make the payments on time and in full every single month. If you don't do so and only make the minimum payment, you will be paying interest on all of the charges on that statement, but at least you won't get a late fee or any kind of delinquency reported on your credit report if you make that minimum payment. So at the very, very least, make the minimum payment, but I never have only paid the minimum. I always pay the statement balance. So what are the consequences of late payments then? Even a single late or missed payment may impact your credit report and credit scores. The nice thing here though is that late payments generally are not going to show up on your credit report for at least 30 days after you miss the payment. So you do have some kind of grace period there, but obviously we just never want to be in that situation. If you are, definitely call up the bank and see if you can get that wiped by obviously paying the fees or doing whatever you need to. But sometimes they will even wipe the fees if you just call them and explain why it happened. So at least implement that strategy if that happens to you. But also note that late fees may quickly be applied after the payment due date. Those usually range from say $25 to $50 depending on the card, and they can continue to increase account balances and hurt your credit history if you do not pay those. So obviously, moral of the story here is don't miss any payments, but if you do, just know that you can call up the bank and Technically, you do have that 30-day period where it's not going to hurt your credit score. But if after that 30 days you don't pay it off, it's going to start hurting you pretty bad. The next most natural question is going to be, well, how do I pay a credit card off? The first thing that I want to note here, because it's the most common question I get all the time when it comes to paying off a credit card, is that for one, you can link practically any bank account to pay off any credit card. And you can also link that same bank account to pay off multiple credit cards, even if that bank account is not from the same lender as those credit cards are. So for example, for me, I use a Chase checking account to pay off all of my credit cards, but I have credit cards from Capital One, Citi, Amex, Chase, all these different lenders, but I can use the same bank account to make all those payments. What I would recommend when it comes to paying off your credit cards is to set up auto pay to pay off your statement balance at or before your due date every single month. This takes out all of the guesswork that we've been talking about here, worrying about minimum payments and payment due dates and statement dates. You don't have to worry about any of that whenever you set up auto pay, as long as your auto pay is set up to pay the statement balance off in full by your due date every month. This is how I'm able to manage 10 of my credit cards. They're all on auto pay and I don't have to ever think about paying them off because they automatically get debited from my account every month. Now, I think one thing that we really need to cover here is understanding your credit score in general. What is it made up of? How do I make it better? That's what we're going to cover right now. So these days, the most prominent credit score model used is from FICO, and there are a variety of different FICO scoring models, including specialized ones from mortgage lenders and car loan lenders and stuff like that as well. But at the end of the day, we're kind of here focused on our credit card credit scores, and FICO credit scores are going to be based off of your FICO credit reports, which is a report given to all three of the major bureaus out there, those being Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. And then your credit report is going to include things like the total amounts that you owe, to whom you owe them, which bank you owe them to, the types of loans you have, how consistently you've paid off your bills every single month, and that goes back as far as 7 years. The basic FICO scoring model is going to be based off of these 5 different factors here that you can see on screen, and the weighting assigned to each is obviously made up by FICO depending on what they deem to be the most important factors here, and that's what we're going to try to maximize. Starting with number 1, the biggest chunk is going to be payment history, which makes up 35% of your credit score. Now, payment history is obviously just going to refer to making your payments on time and in full every single month. If they see late payments or missed payments on your credit report, that payment history is going to be impacted negatively. So the goal here is going to be keeping that category perfect by never missing a payment. That's exactly how I've done it. That's exactly how most people in the credit card game do it. You want this payment history section to be as good as possible because it makes up the largest chunk of your credit score. Even just one missed payment could really decrease your credit score because of how big this factor is. Next up is the second biggest section, that being amounts owed, and that makes up 30% of your credit score. Another way to refer to this section is going to be your credit utilization, which is something we haven't exactly covered yet, but is extremely important. So this section is going to just basically cover the total amount of debts that you owe to lenders compared to your overall credit limits with your credit cards. Again, this breakdown is obviously directed at credit cards here. But the general rule here is that you want your credit utilization to be under 30%. I think that's way too high. I think you want them to be under 10%, and really the lower the better, but we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. But in general, they just don't want to see you maxing out your credit cards every month, having a really high amounts owed, because if so, then they're going to deem you irresponsible and lower your credit score because of that. The next biggest section is going to be length of credit history, making up 15%. And this just refers to how many months or years you've had your credit card accounts. Older accounts are going to be the highest valued because they want to see the longest amount of credit history possible. Hence why earlier I said you don't want to close your oldest credit cards so you can keep that credit history as long as possible, therefore increasing your credit score based on this factor. The fourth factor is going to be new credit, making up 10% of your overall credit score. So in a similar sense to how your credit score is going to be positively impacted if you have a longer length of credit history, new accounts are generally going to hurt your credit score for basically the same reason. At the end of the day though, as long as you're not applying for loans like very, very frequently, this new credit section is not going to impact you very much. They just don't want to necessarily see you going out there and applying for a ton of new loans back to back to back to back, because then they again think that you might be irresponsible and need access to money that you don't actually have. Credit mix is going to be the last factor here, making up another 10% of your credit score. And this just refers to the different types of loans that you have. Technically, the more loans that you have under your name, the better for this portion of your credit score. So if you have, 5 credit cards and then you have a mortgage and a couple car loans, that's all going to actually positively contribute to your credit mix. But that does not mean obviously that you should be taking out more loans just for the sake of helping your credit score, because like we talked about earlier, say you get a loan that you actually can't make a payment on and you mess up your payment history, that's going to seriously negatively impact you, because payment history makes up 35% of your credit score compared to 10% with credit mix. Like we discussed earlier, these credit scores are going to be calculated based on credit products. So a debit card is not going to impact your credit score either way, and that's why for the most part it's good to start building your credit history early, using your credit cards or other loans responsibly, and paying them off on time and in full every single month. Okay, so now we've covered a lot of ground here. We've covered just the basics of credit cards as well as how they work. And sure, I probably missed some stuff in there, but hey, I'm trying my best here. And I think a lot of your questions are still going to be answered by the end of this one. We got a good ways to go here. Now let's get into section 3, which is understanding your credit card statements. And we're going to go through one of my statements so you can see exactly how to do that. Okay, so this is one of my Chase Sapphire Reserve statements from a couple months back. Hopefully blurred out all my information here, but this is what it looks like, just as it is on Chase's website and also, in your inbox. So what we're going to do here is break down each little section here. That way we can, really understand what each one of these numbers and names of all these different things mean. So zooming in on the top left of this statement here, we have a lot of information still that we need to cover. The first number of importance is going to be this new balance in the top. Your new balance in this case is going to be the same as your statement balance, which we discussed earlier. The statement balance is going to be the total amount due after adding up all the payments and purchases or credits and debits to your card that you made during a billing cycle. So this is not your minimum balance or your current balance. This is your statement balance. Any amount of this balance that I do not pay would carry over to next month and I would pay interest on it. Hence why I said we're not going to ever do that. We're going to pay this off on time and in full. So now one balance we haven't really touched on at all yet is the current balance that I just mentioned very briefly. And the difference between a statement balance and the current balance is the following. So unlike the statement balance here, which is a balance based on a set amount of time, your billing period, your current balance is not going to be set to a fixed date, but is just going to be a current snapshot of the total amount that you owe on this card. You're never going to have the option to set up auto pay for your current balance necessarily. So that statement balance is going to be that number that you want to focus on and should be paying off on time and in full. Going down one level, we see the minimum payment due of $40 here. And the minimum payment here is going to be the smallest amount due each monthly billing cycle. So paying this off will help you to avoid penalties and late fees and stuff like that, but it will not keep you from paying interest, which is the important piece. If I only paid off $40 here, I would have $202.58 still left over that would roll over to the next month and start accruing interest. Taking a step down one more, the payment due date is going to be the date that you need to make your payment by. We already covered that, so I'm not going to go into any more detail. Underneath the calendar here, you do see that Chase will give you a late payment warning as well as a minimum payment warning, which is really nice, and I actually didn't even know they did that. They also give you a little calculation table down here saying that if you only made the minimum payment, how long it would take you to pay off this one balance. And as you can see, you'd be paying it off in 7 months and paying $265. So again, just more reason to not ever miss your payments. We also have my ultimate reward summary, which is the point summary on this credit card. This is obviously not super important to understand here at this point because we're not focused on maximizing our points right now, but it does show you your previous point balance, how many points you currently have on the card, how many were transferred to this card, and how many you used on it, but nothing super important for this section right now. Now coming down to the account summary here, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So you're going to see your previous balance as the first number here of focus, and that's going to be the total balance that was reported on your last statement. Then you have the payments and credits under that, which refers to any payments or credits made within that statement period. You have purchases under that, which are all of the new purchases that you put on this credit card in this statement. You have cash advances, balance transfers, fees charged, interest charge. All of those really should be zero as long as you're paying off your cards on time and in full. Then you finally have your new balance down there, which basically just nets out all of the stuff from above. And that is your statement balance once again. Underneath that, we have the opening and closing date, which is going to refer to your statement period or your billing cycle. As you can tell here though, the opening and closing date are different from your payment due date, and they're different by a good bit. If we can scroll back up here, we can see that the payment due date is on December 1st of 2023, but this opening and closing date is from October 5th, 2023 to November 4th of 2023. So the payment due date is usually going to fall roughly 25 days after your statement close date. And that's because credit card companies give you a grace period in order to get the money ready to make your payment basically. But your statement is generated at this closing date. And then that is how everything is calculated for you going forward. But do remember the differences between these dates here, because that will come back in part 4, I believe, where we'll be talking about credit utilization and making early payments and stuff. Obviously the due date is important, but the closing date is very much important when it comes to credit utilization. Underneath that, of course, you have your credit access line, which is your total credit limit on that card, all the money that you have access to. But again, it's not your money, it's the bank's money. So if you spend all that money and you can't pay it back, you're going to be screwed. And then your available credit was how much money you had left over to spend based on your total credit limit. Theoretically, it should be pretty close to the credit access line because we want to keep a low utilization. And that's exactly what happens here. We do have the cash access line under that, which is the total amount of cash you could pull out and access from your card. Then the available for cash would be the same as the available credit in the sense that it would show me how much more I could have pulled out. As you can see here, those numbers are the same because I would never pull cash out of a credit card personally. Because if you did that, then you would be charged a cash advance fee at the top here and things just get a little bit funky wonky. At the end of the day, credit cards should not be used in that sense, I don't think. I think you should only be using cash that you actually have access to, unless you're talking about a mortgage or an auto loan or something like that, but that's besides the point. Then we come down to the final summary here, which just shows us our payment due date once again of December 1st, 2023. The new balance or statement balance on my card of $242.58, and the minimum payment due of $40, which of course I would just not even pay attention to that last one because we are paying off the statement balance every month. You can also see here that auto pay is on, which like I mentioned before is something that I think is really important to have on all the time. That way you just never have to worry about your cards and they automatically take care of themselves. Now, when it comes to your statement, another important piece of this is being able to identify problems. I did not go through the activity section of this statement, which is a whole nother page showing you all the transactions that happened within that statement. And that's because obviously I don't want to dox myself. I'd basically have to blur out the whole thing, but it is a really good practice to just ensure that all those transactions were actually made by you. I personally have a big master spreadsheet that I use to track every single one of my expenses and pieces of income. So for me, I track this manually myself and therefore don't need my statements because I use a third-party platform in order to get all those transactions imported. But I do think that it's a very important practice to, one, budget your money effectively and make sure that you're only putting charges on your cards that you can afford, as well as making sure that you're not getting charged for something that might have actually been fraud in the first place. Next up, moving into section 4, we have responsible credit card usage. At the end of the day, being responsible with your credit cards is really the only way to make the game work in your favor. If you're not responsible, like I said at the beginning of this video, you automatically lose. Doesn't matter how many points you earn, how many sign-up bonuses you hit, it all gets wiped out if you get stuck in the credit card debt spiral, as we've discussed already. Like I just mentioned, one way that I've found that's really helped me to budget my finances is having a master spreadsheet where I literally track every single bit of money that goes in and out of all of my accounts, because that helps me to, one, just stay accountable to myself and not spending money I don't have or shouldn't be spending in the first place. But it also just gives me a good insight into my pain points of where I spend maybe too much money in general, or where I need to actually be maybe focusing more of my money and attention to, because at the end of the day, money is a tool. Yes, of course, this is a video about the credit card game, but I think that budgeting in general is a practice that most everybody should implement, especially when we see how badly the US is just in debt in general. The name of the game here is just being responsible, and I think budgeting plays a massive role in helping you be responsible, not only with credit cards, but just in your day-to-day life. If you are somebody though that is worried about overspending on credit cards, I think at this point you probably wouldn't be watching this video, but if you are, just don't get any. Just use a debit card how it's intended to be used, because those rewards are never going to outweigh the credit card debt that you get in. But one practice that you can use if you are just nervous about the credit card game in general is to literally manually pay off your credit cards either every weekend or every single day or something like that. This is something I recommend that my buddies do once they move from debit cards to credit cards, because you might just not be used to not seeing that money immediately come out of your account when you use a credit card versus a debit card. But if you start to get in the habit of paying those cards off every single weekend, for example, you'll be able to see that money coming out of your account pretty quick, and that'll help you to better manage your finances going forward. Eventually, you're going to get to the point where this is completely in your control and you don't really worry about those things anymore. So auto pay is going to always be your friend at the end of the day. But in the beginning stages, it's super important to lay those foundations correctly. Now it's time to get into a fun slide here where we're going to be talking about something I'm pretty passionate about, and that is going to be managing credit utilization. As we talked about earlier, credit utilization is a massive factor in calculating your credit score, and it makes up 30% of your total credit score. So in order for us to optimize this value, we want it to be as low as possible. Kind of. What I've found based on my experience, as well as a lot of data points that I've read online, is that keeping a 1%, 1 to 2% credit utilization is actually better than 0% in a lot of cases. A 30% credit utilization is generally what you're going to read being recommended by people online, but that is really not the best recommendation in my opinion. I think under 10% is a much better target to have, but still obviously not the best. And I think that a 1%, 1 to 2% credit utilization is really the golden number here. And just to explain why that's the case without going too much in detail, it mainly comes down to the banks wanting to see you manage your credit limits responsibly, but they don't want you to not use them at all. So if you're making early payments to your credit cards, for example, right before the statement close date, and you're bringing your utilization down to 0%, they're going to be like, oh, I guess, they're not really using the card at all. So they're not going to reward you necessarily in your credit score for not using a card. But if they do see a 1 to 2% utilization, they see you using it more, but also paying it off in full and on time by the due date every single month, therefore increasing your credit score in return. I guess that's kind of a very simplistic way to look at it, but hopefully helps paint the picture a little better. And one thing I do want to note though about credit utilization in general is that it is something that fluctuates month to month. So maybe one month you have a really high credit utilization for some reason, and maybe you just didn't make your payment early enough or something like that. Your score might drop 20, 30 points in a month, and you might be like, oh my God, that's terrible. But the next month, if your credit utilization is back to 1 to 2% rather than the 40 or 50% that it was at that one month, your score is going to rise again. And it's one of those factors that doesn't really have a long memory. I did include a little graphic here on the side talking about how credit utilization is calculated. Basically just take your total debt divided by the total credit limit available, multiply by 100 to get it in percentage form. And that's your credit utilization. So if you had $1,000 credit limit, 1% of that credit limit would be $10. And that might be crazy for you to think about, well, how do I only use $10 on my credit card every month? But we're actually just about to talk about that. So how do we lower our credit utilization, especially if we're trying to keep that 1% every month and don't necessarily have super high credit limits? The first method is going to be making early payments. In order for these early payments to actually work, you need to be making your payments before the statement close date and not just the payment due date. Of course, you always need to be paying off your cards in full by the payment due date, and that's what I let auto pay do for me. But to lower your credit utilization, like I mentioned earlier, your statement balance is reported to the credit bureaus on your statement close date, meaning that to lower that utilization, lower that total amount owed before it gets reported, you need to make that early payment before the statement close date, which was 25 days before the payment due date, if you remember that. So this requires a lot of discipline, but it is really rewarding whenever you do it. If you go from, say, a 40% utilization on average to a 1%, you're going to see a drastic increase in your credit score. The second method is going to be credit limit increases, which I've covered in multiple videos on my channel. But in general, after having a card for, say, 6 months or so, you might start to receive automatic credit limit increases depending on how much you're using your cards. But if you don't see one of those come in automatically, you can always manually request one. I would just be sure to check for hard pull language before doing so, because ideally you do not want a hard pull for a credit limit increase, and you want to save those for new card applications just to manage your credit score better. But if you really need an increase, it might be worth it still. Really, no matter how you're able to get your credit utilization lower, I would recommend trying to do it. 30% of your credit score being made up of that factor alone means that it's something you should be putting attention towards rather than the other smaller percentages. And if you're basically just making your payments on time, which makes up 35% of your score, and having a low utilization, making up 30%, 65% of your score is going to be in a very good position, meaning your credit score is going to be high. All right, now we get into the fun section here. Section 5, maximizing credit card benefits. This is where we really become a master here. Well, at the end of the day, this is really what my channel is all about. So while I could make a 5-hour video on this section alone, I'm going to try to cover all the high points as much as possible, and then we'll make further videos breaking this specific section down in detail in the future. But of course, if you're super interested in this section, that's what my whole channel is made up of, so just go watch the other videos if you want to. So for starters here, most of y'all might know this already, but there are two main camps that people fall into in the credit card game, that being Team Cashback and Team Travel. Of course, there are hybrids of this. I actually think being a hybrid is the best approach to the credit card game, but breaking it down side by side is going to help us understand exactly maybe where you should go with your credit card setup. So starting with cashback credit cards, the pros of these cards is that one, you're earning straight up cash rewards basically that just go in your pocket, well, in your bank account, but you get the point. And usually these cards have no annual fees, which make them very easy to add multiple of and not have to worry about getting positive value from or not. Plus, they're just extremely simple. You have one redemption method basically that you use. You just get direct cash back to your bank account, and you use those credit cards on specific categories that give you, say, 5% cash back, and you kind of just set it and forget it. The cons of cashback credit cards, though, is that they do have value caps on them. What I mean by that is that the maximum amount of value you can usually get in redeeming your points on these credit cards is 1 cent per point, meaning that 100 points is worth $1. And as we'll see with the travel credit cards, you can get much higher than 1 cent per point. But with cashback, you usually cannot do any better. On top of that, they do lack travel rewards. So there's not a lot of cashback specific credit cards that will help you travel the world for free if that's something you're interested in. And that's not just when it comes to earning categories and stuff like that, but more when it comes to the travel protections, the travel benefits, airport lounge access, all of that kind of stuff you're not going to get on a cashback credit card, usually again. And with that being the case, a lot of cashback credit cards do have foreign transaction fees. This is a point that I thought about including versus maybe just not, but it does seem to happen much more frequently with cashback credit cards having foreign transaction fees than it does travel specific credit cards. So I thought it was worth at least including. We do have some international watchers here, so hopefully that helps out a little bit. On the travel side of things, the biggest pros of travel credit cards are one, that you're earning points and miles compared to cashback. And this is how we're going to be getting a lot more value from our points than the cashback credit cards would give us. You also get exclusive travel perks, like I mentioned before, when it comes to like airport lounge access, hotel status, airline status, random stuff like that. Then the value of your points that you earn on these cards are technically uncapped. You might be able to find some really crazy international first class flight redemptions that give you 10 cents per point compared to 1 cent per point that cashback would give you. But at the same time, that shouldn't always be expected. I think it's much more realistic that you get closer to, say, 1 to 2 cents per point on average, depending on how you're traveling. Specifically domestically, you'd be getting lower cent per point values. But the cool thing is with travel credit cards is that you do open up your optionality to get those high cent per point redemptions if you want to travel in that fashion and dedicate the time to find the right redemptions. The cons with travel credit cards, on the other hand, is that a lot of them have annual fees on them, and sometimes really, really high annual fees. For example, my Chase Sapphire Reserve has a $550 annual fee. It has a ton of credits and benefits that do help to offset that. But if you're somebody that's not traveling a lot, you don't want to pay an annual fee for something like that, since you'll never be using the perks and benefits anyways. So I do want to mention that annual fees in general are not a bad thing. I think the number that really matters is your effective annual fee, meaning that, say, for this card, I get $500 worth of value from it every single year. My effective annual fee is $50 compared to $550, which is a much more important metric. And in a lot of cases, your travel credit cards are going to give you positive value and a lot of it. So say this card is a $550 annual fee card, but it gives me $1,000 worth of value every single year. That's $450 worth of positive value I got from this card compared to maybe $100 of positive value on a cashback card. It just all depends on how you use your points, how you travel and stuff like that. But I did want to mention those factors here. Another con with travel credit cards is that usually the best way to redeem your points is going to be for travel redemptions, obviously. So if you want cash back, a lot of travel credit cards are not going to actually give you a respectable rate for that, unless they come from a company like Chase, for example. But it's good to keep that in mind, that you do lack some optionality still, depending on what ecosystem you get cards from. And then also, it's super complex. You can see I already spent a few minutes talking about travel credit cards here, and that's because there are so many intricacies with them. But with all of that work you put in, you can get a ton of value. So it's kind of a pro and a con. So one other way to summarize both of these credit cards here in a quick and simple fashion is that cashback credit cards are for those who just want simplicity, they don't travel very much, and they don't need a lot of upside value. Travel credit cards are the opposite. They're for people that, one, travel frequently, are okay with complexity and finding redemptions that work for them, and are looking for the most upside possible. And in my opinion, there's one type of credit card that rules them all, that being a transferable currency type of credit card that also has a respectable cashback rate associated, like cards from Chase and even Citi, for example. With my Chase cards, I can redeem for cashback at 1 cent per point if I wanted to, but can also transfer out to their travel partners like Hyatt or Air Canada or Air France, where I could get maybe 2, 5, 10 cents per point in value. So I have options for both. Amex, on the other hand, does not give you that optionality. You really can only redeem for travel unless you have very specific credit cards. So again, depending on what you value the most will dictate what ecosystem you should be getting cards from. Now, we talked about the two different types of credit cards, at least the main ones, but we need to also discuss the redemption methods associated and which ones you should be using and which ones you should be avoiding. So some of the good methods that I would recommend looking into are, obviously, for one, if you're on Team Cashback, redeeming for cashback at 1 cent per point. If you are somebody on Team Travel though, and you're wanting to transfer your points out to partners, I would not ever redeem your points for cashback necessarily, unless you just really needed to. But for those on Team Cashback, that's obviously the best approach you can take, really. On top of that, if you're on Team Travel, booking flights and hotels and stuff through a travel portal at least a 1 cent per point value is a good redemption. Certain hotels that are like boutique hotels might not be able to even have points transferred to them. And if you got, say, 1.5 cents per point in the travel portal with a card like the Chase Sapphire Reserve that I have, then that redemption, I say, is a good one. People may argue that, but at the end of the day, I think it's a respectable redemption at least. And then the absolute best way to redeem your points if you're on Team Travel is going to be through transfer partners, where you can aim to get at least 1 cent per point, but usually at least 2 cents per point or more is the best way to do it. And that's where that insane value is really unlocked. As for bad methods, anything that gives you cash back at less than 1 cent per point is not something you should be doing. Really, any redemption in general at less than 1 cent per point is not worth it, but especially if you get some kind of credit card that gives you a low cashback rate. For example, Amex credit cards, like I mentioned. If you don't have the Amex Business Platinum or Charles Schwab Platinum, the maximum amount of value you can redeem for in cashback form is 0.6 cents per point. That's horrible. That just decreases all your value in half, all your earning multipliers, all that stuff. So just don't do that. Also, gift cards are a sneaky one. Sometimes they do have bonuses going on where you can get like 1.25 cents per point for gift cards and stuff like that. But outside of those times, I would see a lot of them being worth less than 1 cent per point, and you just don't want to be doing that. And then also Amazon is a bit of a tricky one too. They usually will only give you, I see, like 0.8 cents per point. And if that's the case, you're much better off either redeeming for cashback at 1 cent per point and then paying for those purchases with that cashback you just redeemed for. So always just read the fine print and make sure you're getting at least 1 cent per point for all of your redemptions. So like I mentioned, the gold standard for redemptions is going to be transferring your points out to travel partners. That's how people make all these crazy redemptions to say Bora Bora and all this stuff. It's going to be through transfer partners. But a couple of realistic examples for you in the sense of how travel partners can either be good or bad are going to be these two that I've personally done that I'm going to cover really quickly. The first one being a Marriott property that I stayed at recently, and that was in Florida when I filmed some Creator Conversations episodes with Chaz Money Minutes and CJ. And I used strictly Marriott points from my Marriott account to book this hotel, which made it actually a decent and good redemption. But if I would have transferred my points from, say, Chase to Marriott to make this redemption, it would have been really bad because I only ended up getting 0.84 cents per point for that redemption, which is less than 1, which is not good. But I've also booked a flight to Croatia this year, and for the one-way flight that I booked, instead of paying basically $3,000 for this ticket, I only had to pay 68,000 points and $200 in taxes and fees, roughly. And that came out to basically 4 cents per point for that redemption. So that is a very good example of a way to use your points. But as you can see, that was a international flight redemption, and I also booked it in business class, hence why that cent per point value is pumped like it is. So how you redeem is really up to you, but at the end of the day, try to get at least 1 cent per point and be careful with the transfer partners because some partners are much better than others. Okay, so at this point, you may understand what camp of credit cards you kind of are leaning more towards, that being cashback or travel, of course. And like I said, maybe you're a hybrid, and I think that's a good approach. And you also understand how to use your points effectively now to a degree, but that doesn't help you narrow it down all the way in choosing which credit cards are actually best for you. Of course, credit cards not only offer you either cashback or points and miles, but they also offer a bunch of different credits, benefits, protections, and more that all need to be considered. As I hope you've come to learn from my channel at this point, I am not ever going to be somebody that sits here and tells you there is one credit card that absolutely everybody should be applying for, because everybody's situation is so different. It's not possible to do that, and I don't want to ever come off as somebody that says that kind of stuff. But if you do understand the fundamentals of why certain cards will serve you better than others, you can make the educated decision for yourself, and that's what I'm trying to provide you with. So obviously here I'm not going to say this one credit card is good for you, this one is not. I'm going to let you make those decisions yourself. But one big topic I want to touch on, which I kind of already have, is the different lenders and how their ecosystems play well for you or not. At the end of the day, each lender can provide you completely different types of value, and I think that's what's so cool about the credit card game. For example, you can build a super solid cashback setup with Wells Fargo using the active cash as well as the autograph. But with Amex, you can build a beast of a premium travel credit card setup with the Amex Blue Business Plus, Amex Gold, and Amex Platinum cards. And this same idea can kind of be applied to every lender. They each have their own value propositions and are targeted for a specific audience. Honestly, I think the easiest thing to do here is check out my playlist on credit card setups that I have in my channel, because I've covered some of the most popular setups out there, and I obviously go super in depth on each of the cards in those videos, so you can see kind of which route might be the best for you. We'll talk about the value that you get for the annual fees, the different kind of perks and protections and benefits that they each offer. And I plan to continue to add more setups to that playlist over the next year. So at least just keep an eye on that, and maybe that will help to inform you which way you should kind of go. Now, another big question that I've tried to cover on my channel in past videos is the topic of how many credit cards is enough, how many credit cards is too many, etc. Now, I'm of the opinion that the general public doesn't really ever need more than 2 to 5 credit cards, I would say. Credit card enthusiasts like myself are going to have 10, 20, 30 plus credit cards by the end of their life, but that's because we're addicted. And jokes aside, yes, adding a lot of credit cards for the welcome bonuses and stuff like that is super beneficial, and that's how you get the most value from the credit card game. But if that's not sustainable for you and you'd rather just build out a super solid duo or trifecta or something like that, I am all for that. My most recommended duo out there to literally like all of my friends that are trying to get started in the credit card game is the Chase Freedom Unlimited and Chase Sapphire Preferred. And the main reason for that is because Chase's ecosystem, I believe, is the most beginner / intermediate level friendly out of all of the lenders. Plus you get a ton of value from their credit cards. The sign up bonuses are awesome. All of that stuff is good too, but it gives you the most flexibility and most optionality out of the lenders while packing a punch. But at the same time, since you're kind of getting the best of both worlds, being able to redeem redeem for cashback at say 1 cent per point and being able to redeem for travel through transfer partners at 2, 5, 10 cents per point. If you're somebody that never wants to travel, it would make a lot more sense to go with a cashback specific setup from someone like Wells Fargo, for example, compared to trying to play the best of both worlds. And if you're somebody that literally never wants to redeem for cashback, then maybe the Amex trifecta is much better for you. Yes, they have much heftier annual fees, but they do have a lot of benefits with their cards. They are just a much more travel focused setup rather than cashback. Granted, they have cashback credit cards too, but I think you get the point. There's also the topic of airline and hotel credit cards here that we haven't talked about. But to be honest, I personally just prefer to focus on transferable currency credit cards way more than those cards. But if you are getting later into the game and you say frequent a specific hotel or airline all the time, maybe it is worth adding some of those cards to your setup. I just don't think that they necessarily make up your core credit card setup, but maybe a secondary benefits card setup like my buddy Stan the Credit Frog has talked about. But again, to answer this question, there's no magic number as to how many credit cards you should have. It really just all depends on your preferences, your spending habits, what benefits you need, and all of that. I know what I just covered might be a little bit high level and you might not feel like you have a concrete answer after this, but through my channel, through my videos, I just want to set y'all up with the tools and abilities to make your own decisions in the credit card game. I'm of course always open to DMs on Instagram and stuff like that to help you figure out your setups personally, but I cannot address every single one of y'all in a specific video, hence why the topics have to be pretty general. I also do the one-on-one paid calls for those in the more advanced stages of the credit card game, but of course always just shoot me a DM first, because a lot of times we might be able to figure out your problem without ever having to get on a call. All right, we covered a ton today. I don't even know how long this video is going to be by the end of it. I think I've recorded for like 2 hours, so it's going to be a lot, but I want to go ahead and just do a review of everything we just covered. Like I said before, everything is chaptered down below, so you can go through and scroll through all the different sections and make sure that you get your questions answered. Hopefully it's also search engine optimized to the point where if you just search certain topics in YouTube, this video will pop up, but I don't know how they're going to do it. But yeah, let's just summarize all the key topics we talked about. Remember, section 1, we covered credit card basics. That included stuff like the difference between a credit versus a debit card, what annual percentage rates are and how dangerous credit cards can be if you use them wrong, the different components of a credit card, how to get approved for them, and all of that information. Then in section 2, we talked about how credit cards work, which we discussed the importance of paying off your cards on time and in full every month, how to actually pay your credit cards off. We broke down exactly how your credit score is calculated to hopefully help you understand that better, and more as well. In section 3, understanding credit card statements, we broke down one of my actual credit card statements line by line so you can see what each one of those numbers and names mean. And in section 4, we talked about responsible credit card usage, including just tips for budgeting your expenses, avoiding credit card debt, and managing your credit card utilization. And then in section 5, we did a broad overview of how to maximize your credit card benefits, talking about team cashback versus travel, how you should be redeeming your points and how you should definitely not be redeeming your points, how to choose the right credit cards for you and how many credit cards you should have in general, and hopefully set you up to the point where this year you can finally attack the credit card game and earn a ton of profits from your cards that you might not have been able to do before because you just maybe didn't understand everything that had to go into them. Now, like I've said, I definitely missed some stuff in this video and I'm apologizing for that now, but it's just really impossible for me to cover everything in even a 2-3 hour long video. So eventually we're going to be covering topics more in depth, and like I mentioned at the beginning, if you go ahead and leave your questions down below, I'll do my best to get to as many as I can in the first few days of this video being up, but I'm hoping that the community can come together and just help each other out, because that's, I believe, the subscribers that I've fostered on my channel, and that's why I want to stick around. With all that being said, if you're still here, I do not know how you won't be successful in the credit card game this year, because you obviously have a dedication to this, and I'm super excited to just hear more about how your journeys have either started or continued this year. And if you ever have questions, please feel free to reach out to me, like I said, on Instagram or Discord or what have you. I try to answer stuff as much as I can. And finally, if you want to just continue to deep dive into this credit card game, I'm going to leave a few playlists up here that you can check out after this that I think will help you get started in that path. And as always, I don't know if you can see Odin back there, but we really do appreciate you watching this video. If you did enjoy it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, and we'll catch you guys next time.